Computer Programming for Kids, Step 10, Switching Modes. So we need to write the code that switches the app between the two modes, the Show Progress mode, while the user is answering the questions, and the Show Score mode once all the questions have been answered, and then back to the Show Progress mode again if they choose to go through the questions a second time by clicking the next button again. A mode is a state of being, you might say. You could say that you are in one mode when you're awake and another mode when you're asleep. Or think of a turtle when his head is hidden inside his shell and when his head is poking out on the outside, looking at you and wondering where your shell is. Those are two different modes of turtleness. Or picture an armadillo when it is in its normal mode, which is shown in a picture below on the left, as opposed to the mode it transforms itself into when it rolls itself up into a ball, which is shown in the picture below on the right. To write the code to change the mode, let's think about this a little bit first. What needs to change and when? As to what, there are at least 5 components of the form that will change based on the state or mode the app is in. The Show Score button, which will be either enabled or not based on the mode. The progress bar, which value it will display depends on the mode. The 3 labels above the progress bar, the first one changing its text and the other 2 toggling back and forth between being visible and not being visible. Since we are going to be referencing them in code, let's change the name property of the 3 labels above the progress bar. We will change them from their generic /default /boring names, label 2, label 3, and label 4, to label morphable, label nino, and label geezer. We do that by changing their name property in the Properties pane. In connection with that, we need to add code that will update the in part of the text that the label now named label morphable displays, which is question in of 10. To do so, add this method somewhere in your code, such as after the calculate age and display method. And then a block of code shows, which is somewhat intimidating looking probably, a little involved, so we'll explain it. Note, you might remember that a block of code with a name such as update question number label is called a method. The interesting or weird thing about the code above is the 0 within the curly braces within the string constant. The left curly brace 0, right curly brace part of question of 10, that is. What in the world is that? It's a placeholder. It means replace this part with the first argument passed to the string.format function. What? The string.format function, which you can see in the code above, is assigned to the label's text property on the last line of code above. It takes the string constant we just declared in that code, called base q in of 10, as its first argument, or in common English, the first thingamajig it's given to work with, sees that it has one placeholder, the curly brace encapsulated 0, and replaces that placeholder with the value of the variable named sequence. Since the sequence variable is an int, or integer, it needs to be changed into a string to be made part of label morphable's text property. So, in plain English, that last line of code above is basically saying, assign the base q in of 10 string to the morphable label's text property with its left curly brace 0, right curly brace part replaced with the current value of the variable sequence. So, when sequence is 2, the string will read question 2 of 10. When sequence is 7, it will read question 7 of 10. Etc. You get the picture. For the code to run and have an effect on the label, you need to call the update question number label method from somewhere. Do that in the load next batch method, like so. And then the code snippet shown below shows the pertinent part of that method, load next batch, in context, showing the call to update question number label. So we call the update question number label method after the value of the sequence variable is incremented in the first line of code above, where it says sequence plus plus. Now the question is, when do we change modes in the code? The app starts off in show progress mode. It switches to show score mode once all 10 questions have been answered, and the user clicks the show score button. It then switches back to show progress mode if the user clicks the next button yet again. Rather than have the mode code sprinkled throughout, cluttering things up, let's write a method to handle the switching between modes. That method will toggle from one mode to the other. We will call the method at the places where the mode needs to change. It may be easier to just show you rather than try to further explain it. First, we need to add another variable to the top of our code. This time, it's not an int. We could make it an int and have 0 stand for one mode and 1 stand for the other, but it makes more sense to use a bool data type when there are only 2 modes. So add the following line of code where the other int variables are located. For example, right below int step amount equals 10. And the code is bool in progress mode equals true. Note, the data type named bool is short for Boolean. If interested, you can Google the origin of that seemingly odd word or name. Spoiler alert, it stems from a cat named George Boole. What you need to know for now is that a bool takes one of 2 values, true or false. If there were more than 2 modes, we could not use a bool. We would have to use an int or something else. We'll get to what the something else might be in a later step. Here's the code, the method that we will add. And then it shows the swap modes method. Note, you might have noticed that the last line of code above the final right curly brace, which assigns 0 to the progress bar's value property, is not inside either the if or the else block of code. That means that it runs in either case, regardless of which mode we are in. We could put that line of code inside both the else and the if sections, but that would be redundant. A programming principle we will talk about more later, but worth mentioning briefly here, is referenced as DRY, D-R-Y, which stands for don't repeat yourself. If you only need to write something once, keep it simple and do that. You can put the method above anywhere in the code file, that is the form1.cs file, but I recommend adding it either just above or just below the calculate age and display method. Now, let's call the swap modes method from the places where the mode needs to change. Add a call to it in the code for the next button, click, and the part that deals with the value of sequence having become 10. In other words, all the questions have been answered. The new code is bolded, as always, and then it shows a block of code calling swap modes at the end of the else block. Also add a provisional call to our new method at the top of that code block. From now on, I won't mention that the bolded code is new. I'll expect you to remember that. And then it shows a piece of that code, a snippet of code from that method in the case where sequence is 0, which looks for the value of the in progress mode Boolean variable. And if it's not in progress mode, then it calls swap modes. What the exclamation mark means in the C# programming language is not. So the new line of code above is saying literally, if not in progress mode, swap modes. Or, in less caveman-like speech, if the bool variable in progress mode is not true, in other words, it's false, and so we are not currently in progress mode, call the swap modes method to switch modes. Since in progress mode is false if swap modes is called here, the else part of the swap modes method will run, and it will finally change in the in progress mode bool variable back to true. We could also have written the above code this way, enclosing the call to swap modes in a pair of curly braces, and it shows a slightly different variation of the code that was previously shown, making it perhaps a little more clear but taking up more space. But it's not necessary to put just one line of code within a curly brace block. You can if you want to, though. In fact, you can even do this. Some people prefer doing it this way, in fact, to save space, I guess. And yet another way of writing the code is shown. It's the same exact code, it's just formatted a little differently. In fact, you could even write it like this, and then it shows the code all jammed together, not put on different lines. And the compiler wouldn't care or complain. It would run just the same as long as you leave spaces where they belong and put semicolons where they are needed. It's the exact same thing, just laid out differently, formatted differently. But it would be hard to read, not to mention 9 times uglier than a bag of butts. Enough of that, though, for now anyway. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We still need to write the code in the Show Scores button event handler. We do that this way. 1. In the designer, the form.cs designer tab, form1.cs designer tab, double-click the Show Scores button Show Score. You will be automatically transported to the code file, form1.cs, which will show you this. And then it shows a screenshot of what it actually looks like inside Visual Studio. It's all color-coded. The various parts of the code are color-coded, which we'll talk about later, and it's very handy. Between the curly braces, add the call to calculate age and display, so that the code is now, and then it shows the event handler for the button show score click event, calling that method, calculate age and display. It works pretty well now, but let's also add a label to show the exact score. Drop another label onto the form from the toolbox and place it to the right of the Show Score button and above the 9.0 label. Change its name property to Label Score and its text property to nothing, so that this new label becomes invisible for now. In the Calculate Age and Display method, we will assign the new label a value, like so. And then it shows the updated version of that Calculate Age and Display method, assigning to an int variable we've declared locally, called score, the value of age, the age score variable multiplied by 5. Then that score variable is assigned to the progress bar's value property. And the label score that we just added, its text is assigned the value of the score property, converted to a string, of course, so that it makes sense for the label. And then the button show score enabled property is set to false, since it already has been clicked. There is a lot going on here in the Calculate Age and Display method. First, we store the value in a local int variable named score, as mentioned. Note, local variable means that it is only seen or accessible within this method. Other methods cannot reference score. Another programming principle we will discuss later is why it's good to always keep things as private as possible. Then we assign the value of the score variable to the progress bar, as we talked about. After that, we assign that same value to the new label, label score, that we just added. Also, we discussed that. Finally, we enable the show score button so that it can be clicked, now that it makes sense to allow the user to do that after all the questions have been answered. In the next step, things will get more interesting. We will do some more refactoring and make the app more generic so that it can be used not just for guessing ages, but for asking the users any type of multiple choice questions.